Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. The sex of a bird, whether it's male or female, is one of the most critical aspects of its biology. Males and females often behave differently, especially during the breeding season, and in many species, they have strikingly different plumages. This episode features Dr. Hamish Spencer, an evolutionary biologist at the University of Otago in southern New Zealand. Hamish was recently in Colombia, where he was shown a bird that violated these rules. This episode discusses this bizarre phenomenon known as bilateral gynandomorphy. How did it affect this particular bird? How does it arise? How common is it? And which species has it been observed in? So that's all the stuff that we're going to discuss with Dr. Spencer. Thank you so much for being part of the Bird Podcast.
Oh, you're welcome, Shobha. I'm pleased to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with your birding trip to Colombia. Tell us what happened.
So I'm a keen bird watcher in addition to being an evolutionary biologist. And my wife and I went to Colombia as part of an organized bird watching trip. And we had 2.5 weeks exploring Colombia. I'd never been to Colombia before. It was very exciting to go there. And I hadn't really appreciated just what a geographically and geologically diverse country Colombia was. It's a fairly big country. You don't kind of notice that on world maps because it's near the equator, and countries near the equator look smaller than they are compared to ones further away. But Colombia is quite large, but it's also geologically quite diverse. And that diversity has led to an enormous bird diversity too. So there are more different species of bird in Colombia than any other country in the world. And that's extraordinary. I mean, if you had asked me which country has the most different bird species, I think I would have guessed Brazil. And sure, Brazil has a lot of species, and Brazil is a lot bigger. But Colombia has this geology that I'll describe to you in just a minute that has meant that birds have speciated an awful lot, and many of them have fairly restricted ranges. So if you have a look at a map of Colombia, you will notice that the Andes, the high mountains that go along the spine of South America, as you go north from Ecuador, which is just to the south of Colombia, into Colombia, the Andes split into 3 mountain ranges. And they're separated by quite deep valleys not quite, but close to sea level. So there's huge altitudinal ranges. And as you go up those different parts of the Andes, which are imaginatively called the Western, the Central, and the Eastern Andes, if you go up one of those mountain ranges, the bird species change, right? So they have quite specific altitudinal preferences. But if you go up another of those branches of the Andes, you'll find some of the species will be the same at the same heights, but other ones will be different. They might be very closely related to what's on the other part of the Andes, but quite often different species. So they have these 3 ranges that give you all that diversity. But of course, there are also coastal birds, and Colombia has coast on both the Pacific and also the Atlantic in the Caribbean. So it has 2 coasts with rather different bird faunas. And then, if you'd asked me what was the tallest mountain in Colombia, well, I couldn't have told you, but I would have guessed it was in the Andes. Well, it isn't. Just to be extraordinary, there's a little isolated mountain range right in the north of Colombia, almost on the Caribbean coast, and that's called the Santa Marta Mountains, and those mountains are the highest, and they have a whole, as you go up there, a whole endemic fauna. I mean, not everything is endemic, but there's a lot of species endemic to that area. And again, they change as you go up the mountains. And then there's the Amazon, right? So Colombia goes down into the Amazon. So there's a whole different habitat. So there's a huge amount of habitat and a huge amount of species. And then, of course, it's the neotropics. And the neotropics have an enormous number of birds anyway. So that's in short why Colombia has so many species of birds and why it's such an exciting place to go bird watching.
A couple of episodes ago, we interviewed a evolutionary biologist called Dr. Robin, who works in the Shola mountains of southern India. And he too said the same thing, that you have these sky islands, and these are the top of the tall mountains. And then you just go from one mountain to the other in the same habitat, and the bird species change. So it's
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly what's happened in Colombia. There's a little bit of overlap, but you know the Santa Marta Mountains, for example, have been separated for over 10 million years. So not surprisingly, they have their own high species and you know one or two widespread species. But it's so exciting, so exciting. It's the same phenomenon.
So I'd love to hear more about the broad spectrum of birds, but all our listeners are very eager to hear about this special bird that you saw. So let's lead off with that, and then we can go into the details.
Certainly. So when we were in one place fairly central in Colombia, we went to a small farm where the owner of that farm farms fish and various other things, and is also a keen bird watcher. And he pointed out a bird that he had noticed, and he knew exactly what it was. He pointed out this green honeycreeper that was really strange. Green honeycreepers are a pretty bird anyway, and your listeners can have a look at a picture, but it's a funny name really, because the males, they don't really look green to me, they look aqua-blue. But apparently you could call it viridian green, but I think it's blue. But anyway, the females are green. They're a kind of grass green colour. The males also have a little black hood and a yellower beak. So they really look different. So the males and females look different, and that's what we call sexual dimorphism. And there's a small difference in size too, but very tiny. You have to measure a bird in the hand to be able to see that difference. Anyway, the bird he pointed out was female on the left and male on the right. So it was grass green on the left and this aqua blue on the right. And the head was also black, the male colour on the right, and green with a little bit of black speckled in, admittedly, on the left. So it was a bird that looked like it was female on the left and male on the right. And that's extraordinary. I'd never seen a bird like that before. And it's what's known as a bilateral gynandomorph or a bilateral gynandomorph. You can have a hard G or a soft G, whatever you like. It's called bilateral because it's in the two halves, right? So the two halves mean that one half is male and one half is female. And the gynandomorph part refers to the fact that it's got both male and female parts to it. And gynandomorphs have been observed in a number of different species in different parts of the world, but it's pretty rare. We wrote a paper about this bird and we summarized the published records of other gynandomorphic passerines, and there's fewer than 100 in the last 150 years and across all species. So it's pretty rare. Certain species it seems to be commoner in, but I don't know whether that's just because they've been observed a lot. So some birds in North America, for example, have been recorded more frequently as being gynandomorphic, but then there's a lot of bird watchers in North America, so maybe that's to be expected. Anyway, this bird, there'd only ever been one green honeycreeper that had been observed to be gynandomorphic before. That was more than 100 years ago, and it was a dead bird. It was a bird in a museum. And it was round the other way. So instead of like our bird being female on the left and male on the right, it was male on the left and female on the right. So one of the things that makes our observation interesting is that it shows that gynandomorphy can occur this way round or that way round, right? So the male doesn't have to be on the left or on the right. Both possibilities are observed in the real world. So that's very interesting because it also speaks to the mechanism for how this weird phenotype would arise. And what we think has happened, and we don't really know because, of course, it's usually after the fact that you see these things. But what we think has happened is that in the something has gone wrong in the process of female meiosis. So I'll take a step back and give you a quick crash course in some basic genetics here. So humans and other mammals have sex chromosomes whereby females have two identical chromosomes, two X's, and males have an X and a Y. Right? Some exceptions, but that's generally what there is. Birds, however, are around the other way. Right? So birds, the sex with the different chromosomes is the females. So they're WZ, right? And males, on the other hand, have two identical chromosomes, and they are both Z, right? So males are ZZ and females are WZ. Okay, so something's gone wrong in the process of cell division to produce female gametes. So something's gone wrong in the process of producing the female eggs. This is the unfertilized egg, not the fertilized egg that's got the shell around it. So what should have happened is that in the cell division, the Z chromosome should have gone into one of the daughter cells produced by the cell division process, and the W chromosome should have gone into another, right? And that is what's happened, but the cells haven't separated properly. So there's one with a Z and one with a W, and instead of separating completely, and one would become a polar body and one would become what could become a fertilized egg. So they haven't separated, they've stuck together. And the sperm have come along, and they're Z, because males only have a Z chromosome, and they both of those female cells have been fertilized, right? So the Z and the W have both been fertilized. It's what's called double fertilization, right? So those two things have been fertilized, and so one is ZZ and one is ZW, right? So one is going to be a male half and one's going to be a female half, right? And they've stuck together and they've developed, and all the descendants of those two cells, the ZZs, will look male and the ZWs will look female. And you get this bilateral pattern because the cells on one side of the body of the bird have all descended from one of those cells that was fertilized, and the cells on the other side of the bird have descended from the cells on the other side. So have I made that clear, or is that too confusing for you?
Yeah. No. And I was just thinking as an amateur, so then in the future, is the cell, the sticking together going to continue? Which begs the question, is the bird going to be able to produce fledglings?
That's a great question. That's a great question. So I learned a lot about birds in the course of writing up our paper. One of the other things I discovered is that female birds, unlike female mammals, usually have just one functional ovary, and that's on their left side, right? In principle, they ought to have two, right? One on each side, like mammals, but they don't. There are some birds that are exceptions, falcons and hawks, but all passerines, if you're a female bird, you have one functional ovary and it's on the left, right? We don't know why, but it might be something to do with keeping weight down. The short answer is we don't know, but that's one hypothesis. Anyway, so this bird was female plumaged on the left and male plumaged on the right. So it could have had a functional ovary on the left, right? Because the left-hand side of the bird was female, and it could have had a functional testis on the right. We don't know because we didn't catch the bird and dissect it, so we don't know. But when people have looked in the past at gynandomorphs, they have found that pattern, but only sometimes. Sometimes they found it the other way around, is that the plumage didn't match the sex organs inside. How that can be, I don't really understand. I would have thought they would have to match, but they don't, apparently in principle they don't. So this bird, the other thing that people have found when they've looked at examples of gynandomorphic birds that have either been captured or they've got really good field observations, is that sometimes they lay eggs, sometimes those eggs are fertile, sometimes they're not, and there's even a case of one bird successfully fathering chicks. So the short answer is that we don't know. This bird might have been able to have chicks, it might not, it might have laid eggs, it might not. We just don't know. We don't think it did because John Murillo, who was the man who found the bird, observed it for quite some time, over 18 months, and it never he never saw it interact with a bird that might have been a mate. So we don't know for sure, but probably it didn't reproduce.
So it was an impotent bird, or the female version thereof as well.
Well, yeah, maybe we just don't know.
You don't know.
It might have been fully sexually functional, but the plumage put off potential mates, or we don't know, right? There's all sorts of that might have happened. Yeah.
So you've answered a lot of the first initial questions. How does it happen? How did it affect this particular bird? And the short answer is we don't know yet, because we don't know if it's going to lay eggs and if the eggs are fertile. And how does it arise? You've told us very beautifully. How common is it? Okay. And which are we're going to link to one. I found a news article about a cardinal in North America. So which other species has it been observed in? And I also, so maybe we can talk about that. How common is it across species, not just birds?
Yeah, so as I said, there's only one other example in the green honeycreeper, and there are a smattering of records from other species. So indeed, northern cardinal, the well-known North American bird, is another species in which it's been observed, and actually there it's been observed maybe 10 a dozen times, quite a number of different times. Of course, in order to observe it, you have to have a bird that's sexually dimorphic, right? So if you have a species where the males and females look the same, you're never going to notice it, right? Because they look the same whether they're half male and half female, or whether they're all male or all female. So you have to have species that are sexually dimorphic. So in those sorts of species, there's one or two other species where it's been found quite a number of times. Another North American bird is the evening grosbeak, where there's about half a dozen records. And in Europe, the species where it's been found most often is the Eurasian bullfinch, which is, so both grosbeaks and bullfinches are Fringillidae. And that family, there's a number of species where it's been found. It's not very common in tanagers, the Threlpidae. So the Threlpidae are an enormous family, but only found in the Americas, and just huge numbers of species in South America, and slightly fewer in Central America, and just smattering that make it into North America. They're beautiful birds. When you see pictures of beautiful Colombian, colourful birds, they're quite often going to be various species of tanager, and all sorts of colours, anything from bright red to bright blue, and yellows and oranges and blacks, and everything, silver. So there are not many examples of tanagers, and that's interesting because many tanagers are in fact sexually dimorphic. So you would have thought there would have been more observations, but again, I suspect it's to do with having fewer observers there.
Yes. When I first read about the tanager and the cardinal, I thought whether it's to do with brightly colored males, but then the grosbeak and the bullfinch are not especially. So I don't know that is the reason. And the other thing I wanted to mention to you is in Hinduism, and there is a god called Ardhanari, which means half man, half woman. So when my mother looked at this photograph, and the first reaction was, oh, that looks like an Ardhanari, which is half man, half woman goddess. But if you think we're done with any Gynandomorphism, we'd love to hear about highlights of your Colombia trip. I think we've covered pretty much everything as far as the Gynandomorphism is concerned, unless you remember. Something that you
no, that's fine. We had a fantastic time in Colombia. I just can't emphasize it enough. The people were just lovely. I mean, I should just give another shout out to John Murillo, who was the man who discovered this gynandomorphic bird, who took the photos that your listeners and viewers will have seen, and took the video that I believe you're going to incorporate in. And he has got some fantastic camera equipment, but he's also really observant, was a really nice man to meet, and but he was not alone in being a nice man to meet in Colombia. We had a fantastic time. And as I say, the bird diversity is just huge. And just to give you an idea, I mean, we had a guide, again, a fantastic man from Edwin. Well, I suppose he's Panamanian, but he also has Colombian citizenship. And he certainly showed us things, but you could just, there are birds everywhere. We saw in our 17 days, we saw over 550 different species. Now, just to put that in context, that's more than 5% of the different species in the world in 17 days. It's just unbelievable. It was mind-blowing. In fact, it's actually almost literally mind-blowing, because after a while you think, oh, I can't remember which one it is. You know, it's one of these little finches or another tanager, and I can't quite remember what it is, or a woodpecker, and I can't remember where the bands are meant to be on this bird for it to be this species or that species. But it was nevertheless really fun. One of the other things that I try, and I'm very keen on doing when I go bird watching, is to see a diversity of families of birds, right? So the way in which birds are classified, you know, obviously there's closely related species, but every now and then there are birds that are, you know, further apart, and there are a number of endemic families in the neotropics. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to try and see some members of those families that I hadn't seen before. So one bird that your listeners might know about is the hoatzin, which is the very bizarre looking, like a cross between a cuckoo and an Archaeopteryx and I don't know. It's a very strange looking bird with this punk hairdo. It doesn't just look strange, it also has very strange digestive system. You know, it's almost like it's a ruminant, like a cow, right? So it uses bacteria to digest the huge amounts of leaves that it eats. It eats lots and lots of leaves. I mean, it does eat fruit and other things too, but it eats more leaves than many birds do, and it breaks them down with the help of bacteria. And these are much bigger birds than I had expected, and they're in a family all by themselves. And who they're related to has been controversial, and I was delighted when we were in the Amazon area that we saw, well, actually quite a number, about 70 or so of the hoatzin. So that was a real thrill to see. Many of the other things we saw about 55 species of hummingbirds. And you think, well, that's a lot, but there's actually 163 different species just in Colombia. So we didn't even see a third of the hummingbird species in Colombia, even though we saw 55, which is a phenomenal number. And some of the ones we saw, just amazingly beautiful, huge variety in the different shapes and ornaments and colors of the hummingbirds. Lots of tanagers. We saw about just under 80 species of tanager. And again, that's actually fewer than half that are found in Colombia. So, you know, in some ways we just scratched the surface, but you know, we saw lots and lots of different things. One of the other birds we saw was a thing called a rosy thrush tanager. It's not a thrush and it's not a tanager. It belongs in a family all by itself. Again, it's been a bit controversial what it's closest to, but it's a hard bird to see. It's a very noisy bird, sings, you know, and keeps singing and singing and singing and singing, but it's always singing from hidden in amongst leaves and things, or down on the ground, or you know, just really, really hard to see. And we spent almost 90 minutes looking for this bird. It's in a family, as I say, by itself, and I really wanted to see it. And we were just about to give up and just walking back to the truck, and I'm about 2 meters from the truck, and I had one last look, and there it was, not even that far. And we all had great views of it. Once you got onto it, it was easy to see. It's red, it's rosy, rosy red, very interesting color. So we're incredibly lucky with many of the things we saw. We saw something called a screamer, which is a sort of a cross between I don't know, a goose and a vulture or something. I don't know. It's sort of hard to describe, but quite a big bird. And we saw some tinamous, which were, you know, related to ratites, so things to do with, you know, with kiwi and emu and ostrich and so on. They're all related to that group, but tinamou can fly, which is really interesting in it. So they're really important because they tell us something about the evolution of flightlessness in that group of birds. So yeah, it was fantastic, just fantastic. If you ever get a chance to go to Colombia, I can't recommend it highly enough.
Yes, I'm going to do this for your episode, but one of the things I do is link to other episodes. For example, in episode 59, we interviewed Noah Stryker, who did a big year of birding around the world and saw over 6,000 species. And he talks a lot about Colombia and how it's very important in the birding world, and it's a dream destination. And talking about hummingbirds, in episode 37, we interviewed Dr. Anusha Shankar, who talks about how hummingbirds have this hibernation-like ability, and she called it torpor, where they go to sleep at night and reduce their body temperature. So, and the lead up to your next question is in episode 23, we interviewed Jonathan Franzen, who's an acclaimed novelist and also a bird watcher. And I asked him, how do you prepare for such a birding trip? And I'm going to ask you the same thing. Before you went to Colombia, how do you prepare for it? I mean, not in terms of equipment as much as how do you memorize? What do you do before you go?
So it's funny, really. It's not as fun as actually being there bird watching, but it's almost as fun, the preparation, the anticipation. So I bought the most recent field guide to Colombian birds, which is a fantastic book. It's beautifully designed in that that each species account is all there on, there's a lot of species, right? 900 and something species. Sorry, I forgot the number of species now, but anyway, there's the species is not one species per page or anything like that, but all the information's there. There's a map, there's a picture, or sometimes several pictures. There's text which points out the important features. There's little bits of text telling you what similar species there are and how to separate them. And so I had that, and I spent quite a lot of time reading that book. And concentrating on one particular family, for example. So I might spend, a week looking at just hummingbirds, right, and working out, what would be the features that that enable me to distinguish. You learn fairly quickly as a bird watcher that some parts of the bird are likely to be more informative than others, and quite often the features of the head, right, are really important, right? Where the different colors are, whether there's a supercilium, what color it is, how far back it goes behind the eye, does it connect across the top of the beak, what are the colors of the feathers on the throat, and is there an outline or anything like that? All those kinds of issues. But the other thing too is that we had a guide, and I could ask the guide, why is it this species, not that species? Or what are the field marks of this species? And he was really good. Edwin was fantastic. And he said, well, you see this feature or that feature or the song. Learning, I couldn't do songs, for example, but he knew songs, and he would point out features of the songs. And we did get to learn some of the songs. Certainly the rosy thrush tanager we had by the time we finished that.
Can you tell us about birding I think we're sort of done with Colombia, because there's a lot. In episode 10, I interviewed Maitreya Sukumar, who went to Colombia, and then he also went to Papua New Guinea, and so talked about species. So, but we haven't done too many episodes in New Zealand. So you're based in Otago, and can you talk a little bit about, and then I have only one more question after that. Yeah.
So New Zealand is both very exciting and a little depressing, to be honest. It's very exciting in that there are a number of endemic families of birds in New Zealand. I think 5 at last count. And so if you're a bird watcher who's interested in the world's bird fauna, you have to go to New Zealand. You won't see a kiwi anywhere else in the world. And there's several others, our mountain parrot and the kea, which is together with the kaka and the kakapo form another endemic family. So we have a number of endemic families. The most basal passerine, the New Zealand wrens, very exciting bird for bird watchers to see. There's only 2 species left, is that right? Really just an amazing bird. So it's very exciting for that in that respect. But it's also really depressing because we've had a lot of birds go extinct in the last 200 years. People brought rats and cats and dogs with them, and that people subsequently introduced ferrets and stoats and weasels, and our birds had not evolved in the presence of mammalian predators, and we lost about half the passerines, and so that's really sad. But what we've got left, we really treasure, and there's a lot of effort goes into trying to preserve and conserve those species.
Yeah, and you're surrounded by water, so there's a lot of pelagic birds that you have access to.
So actually, if you do come to New Zealand, you need to bring your seasick medication with you, because the seabirds, we have more species of Proceleria forms than we have passerines, and that's not true in nearly everywhere else in the world. And the number of seabird species we have is phenomenal, and many of them breed close by, or they come and look for food in waters. And as you go around the country, there's a significant amount of variation. You do a pelagic trip off Otago here in the south, you can do another one at Kaikoura in the north of the South Island, and you could do another one just north of Auckland, and you would see almost completely different species. So it's a really exciting place to go seabird watching, but you do need to get your sea legs together, or at least take the appropriate medications. But yeah, they can be very exciting. Some of them can be a challenge to identify too, especially when you're bobbing around on the sea. And where we are in Dunedin, it's 46 degrees south, so we're in the roaring 40s, as they say. So it can be a little rough down here.
Yeah. Last question, which I ask everybody, is what are some of your favorite species of birds?
I suppose they have to be some of the New Zealand endemic birds. I'm very fond of a bird called a mohua, which is also called yellowhead in English. It's an endemic family, the Mohuidae, and we've only just realised that it's an endemic family. We thought it was related to some birds in Australia, and it is, but it's been separated for many, many millions of years. So it's an endemic family, and the mohu is a beautiful yellow-headed bird, and they forage in family groups, chattering away the whole time. They're a little bit endangered because they're not very good at dealing with mammalian predators, but when you go to a place where they're just all around you, and they're fantastic. They were called bush canary at one point because they're that bright canary yellow. But I also have a soft spot for cormorants, which is not a bird that many bird watchers are keen on. New Zealand is a hotspot for different cormorant species, and I've worked on those professionally, and they're really, really interesting from a behavioural point of view. They can tell us a lot about the evolution of bird behaviour, and they're also quite interesting from a biogeography point of view too, because many of them have quite restricted ranges, and yet some species are quite widespread. So cormorants, don't just dismiss them as big, black, ugly birds. They're much more interesting than many even bird watchers realise.
I'd love to know more about cormorants, but maybe we do that as another episode. And really, last thing is, which other countries have you gone to, and what is your equipment when you go birding?
So I do own a telescope. I don't use it's difficult to travel with it. So I've been to Colombia, I've been to Brazil and Chile and Ecuador in South America. I've been to Panama and Costa Rica. I actually learned to birdwatch in America when I was a student in America. So I've been to North America and Mexico and Canada. I spent a little bit of time in Europe, not a huge amount. And many, many years ago, when I was just sort of beginning, we did have a week in Botswana and Zimbabwe, right next to it. And of course, I've been to Australia because most New Zealanders have been to Australia. It's our closest neighbour, even though it's a good 3-hour flight away, but it's still our closest neighbour. So I haven't really spent much time in Asia. I've been to China a couple of times, and I've been to Singapore, and that's it for Asia. That's a place I really want to go. I want to go to Papua New Guinea, as you mentioned, just before. I'd love to go to Indonesia. I'd love to go to India, up into Nepal. That would be very exciting.
So then the scope, the spotting scope, and a pair of binoculars. That's it.
Yeah, so I just use a pair of binoculars. I don't take photographs, and the scope doesn't usually go with me. So it's usually just a pair of binoculars, and I do eBird. So I have my phone with me to do eBird, and a notebook, obviously, and a field guide. That's it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Spencer, thank you so much for being a guest at the Bird Podcast.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure talking to you, Shobha.
Thank you. Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I'm Shobha Narayan. Thank you for watching and listening to this episode.